And you have the problem with 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4 to 5. People are preaching a different Jesus. Now
They were. There's a Jesus where you have to enter into the Mosaic covenant to be accepted by him. And Paul's saying that's not Jesus.
Paul's Jesus is the crucified and resurrected Jesus, and people are preaching a different Jesus.
A Jesus who wasn't crucified and didn't rise from the dead. Show us that Jesus anywhere.
No, it's the Q God. That's what I'm saying. If we go back to the Q gospel,
there's nothing in Q about Jesus not dying and not rising from the dead.
Well, Daniel A. Smith will disagree with you in his book.
Daniel Smith believes that Jesus definitely died.
Yeah, because I don't know what his theological views are. Maybe
okay,
he's an atheist. Maybe he's a Christian. I don't know.
Okay, so notice how David Wood just ignores my point, because according to the Q gospel had nothing about Jesus' death and resurrection. And, reading the book, Daniel A. Smith's book, The Empty Tomb, Daniel A. Smith argues that there was no resurrection narrative in the Q gospel. There was the assumption theology and not resurrection theology. Assumption or disappearance. Assumption theology means disappearance, like Jesus' disappearance from the tomb as opposed to his resurrection out of the tomb. So Daniel A. Smith argues in the Q gospel that there was no resurrection, there was no death and resurrection of Jesus according to the Q gospel. So David Wood completely misses the point that I was trying to make. He wasn't. I feel like David Wood wasn't listening to what I was saying, because if you read the Q gospel, there's nothing about Jesus' death and resurrection. And, now David Wood does say that he talks about the post-mortem vindication of Jesus, saying that Daniel A. Smith argues that Jesus died. But Dieter Zeller, that German scholar that Shabir Ali was bringing up in his debates and lectures, Dieter Zeller argues that Jesus was taken into heaven alive from the tomb. But David Wood just dismisses that. So you see what I'm getting at here. David Wood's just dismissing, or he's not listening to what I'm saying. He's just dismissing what I'm saying, and it's not true that the Q gospel had nothing about Jesus' death and resurrection. It's only implied that Jesus' death is implied in some places, but it's not explicit. The Q gospel doesn't explicitly mention Jesus, death by crucifixion and resurrection. If we were to go to Daniel A. Smith's book, he argues about Jesus' disappearance as opposed to his resurrection. So David Wood is not. See, this is the issue I'm having with people like David Wood and Sam Shamoon, etc., is that they don't listen to what you're saying. They don't really listen to what you're saying. They just talk over you, and they don't like listen to, or they don't do it, or they're just being purposely ignorant, or they're purposely lying. Because if David Wood did any kind of research on the Q gospel, like, I think David Wood is a knowledgeable person when it comes to his faith, Christianity. But if you just look up the Q gospel, the Q gospel is not talking about Jesus' resurrection and death. Nowhere does it say that. Just look up the Q gospel. Just read like some books on the Q gospel. And the scholars of the Q document, the Christian scholars of the Q document, talk about it being a sayings gospel that had nothing to do with Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, or Jesus' death and resurrection. So David Wood completely misses my point, or he's not listening to he's not really listening to what I'm saying about the Q gospel. The Q gospel is important because it predates Old and New Testament. It predates Paul. It came before Paul. So Daniel A. Smith argues that there were two separate beliefs. That one belief was that Jesus disappeared, and one belief was that Jesus was resurrected. So the Q community, which very possibly included the disciples, were teaching Jesus' disappearance, and Paul is the one who made up Jesus' resurrection. So Daniel A. Smith argues in his book, The Empty Tomb, that the Gospel of Mark merged both those beliefs into his gospel. That's why you have resurrection theology in the Gospel of Mark, and you have assumption theology. If you read the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verses 1 to 8, the women go to the tomb and they just see an empty tomb. They just see an empty body. They observe Jesus' missing body. So, you know, Daniel A. Smith argues that that's assumption language, or the author of Mark was talking about Jesus' disappearance in the Gospel of Mark and not his resurrection, you know, after the crucifixion. But anyways, David, my point of making this, the whole point of me making this video is that David Wood just does not listen to what I'm saying. He wasn't listening to what I'm saying. And anybody who does research on the Q gospel knows that it's not talking about Jesus' resurrection. It's talking about his assumption. So the whole point is that, you know, when I was arguing with David Wood is it's theological. If you want to believe Jesus died, that's fine. It's a theological view. As Christians, you have to believe it. If you believe Jesus died as an atheist, that's fine too, because you don't believe in the supernatural. You don't believe that God does miracles or keeps people alive through, you know, dangerous ordeals like Jesus went through. You know, and as a Muslim, I believe Jesus survived. It's a theological view, because if God can work through Jesus, why can't he keep Jesus alive through the crucifixion? Again, it's a theological view that people like David Wood can't disprove without being inconsistent. And that's the whole problem with Christian apologists. They always accuse me of being inconsistent, yet they're inconsistent too, because they have to throw the Bible under the bus in order to believe, or in order to defend their beliefs about Jesus' death and resurrection in the New Testament, which contradicts the Q gospel. So stay tuned for more. I'm going to analyze more of David Wood's claims, but stay tuned. You know, I do have some more comments to say about this discussion or debate, but kudos to David Wood for behaving really well and giving me, you know, not interrupting and letting me talk. David Wood is a lot better than Sam Shamoun, so I'll gladly have another debate with David Wood on evidence for Islam, or some other, maybe another resurrection debate, because I always enjoy talking to David Wood about these theological issues. It's always better, you know, dealing with him as opposed to the ignorant and uncivilized Shamoun. Stay tuned, more videos coming up ahead.